The first thing they noticed about Sergeant Weston was her hands. Not her file, not her scores from sniper school at Fort Moore, where she'd qualified expert on every platform they put in front of her. Not her 18 months embedded with a Special Operations Advisory Group in Kandahar province. Her hands, too small, someone said, for the Barrett M82. Too small to run the .50 caliber properly in a sustained engagement. Someone actually said that out loud in a briefing room at Camp Taji in the spring of 2018, and nobody corrected him. Weston was standing 6 feet away when he said it. She didn't look up from the map table. That was the first thing you needed to understand about her. Not the shooting, not the decorations she never talked about. The stillness, the way she processed things that would have made most people walk out of the room or say something they'd regret. She had a particular quality. Her team sergeant, a 20-year master sergeant named Okafor, would later describe it as a kind of compressed patience, where she absorbed whatever the room threw at her and converted it into something useful. Fuel, he said. She ran on it. The team she was attached to was a 12-man Special Forces ODA, Operational Detachment Alpha, working out of a joint task force hub in northern Iraq during the second phase of the campaign to retake the Nineveh Plains. Her role was designated as a long-range precision fire asset, which in practical terms meant that when the team needed someone to reach out past the range where conventional firepower became imprecise, they called Weston. She was attached, not assigned. The distinction mattered to certain people on that team. Okafor had requested her specifically. He'd seen her work once, from a distance, through a spotting scope during a training rotation at Grafenwohr, and he'd put in the paperwork before she'd even slung her rifle. He knew what he was looking at. The rest of his team took longer. There was a staff sergeant named Buell who made most of the noise. He wasn't a bad soldier. Decorated, experienced, the kind of man who had genuinely earned the right to have opinions in that building, but he carried the particular confidence of someone who had never been wrong in a way that cost him personally. He looked at Weston's 5'4" frame, her quiet manner, the way she sat in the corner of the briefing room with a notebook rather than talking, and he made a calculation. The calculation was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. No offense, he said, during her first week on the team, but the .50 is a man's weapon. The recoil management alone. None taken, Weston said, and went back to her notebook. Okafor watched this exchange from across the room and said nothing. He'd learned something in 20 years. Some lessons couldn't be taught. They had to be witnessed. The operation they were planning was called Winter Shelf. It was a reconnaissance and targeting package for a 3-day overwatch mission in the Sinjar Mountain range, specifically a ridgeline above a valley road that intelligence had flagged as a resupply corridor for a reconstituting cell. The task force wanted eyes on vehicle traffic and, if the opportunity presented itself, they wanted that corridor disrupted. A 2-person sniper element would establish a hide site at approximately 20,400 feet elevation, roughly 1,100 meters from the target road, and remain in position for 72 hours. Okafor designated Weston as the shooter. He designated a younger intelligence sergeant, a quiet Ohioan named Krebs, who had requested the assignment, as her spotter. Buell requested a meeting. With respect, he said, this is the wrong call. The mission profile requires sustained precision fire at range. We need someone who's done this in a real engagement, not a training environment. Weston has done this in a real engagement, Okafor said. Kandahar, and 2 other deployments before that. Buell paused. He hadn't read her full file. Most of them hadn't. I still think, noted, Okafor said. The meeting was over. What nobody on that team knew except Okafor was that Weston had held a sniper section record at Fort Moore for 18 months, not a women's record, a record. Highest confirmed score across all platforms in a single qualification rotation in 3 years. The instructor who'd written her evaluation had used the word clinical. Not skilled, not talented, clinical. The distinction was intentional. There was a difference between someone who could shoot and someone who understood, at a level most people never reached, the complete physics of the problem. Wind, elevation, density, altitude, target movement, the particular way a .50 caliber round behaved at distance. The holdover calculations that most shooters did by feel, and Weston did by math that she'd worked out years ago, and now ran automatically, the way a pianist doesn't think about individual keys. She didn't tell any of this to Buell. She didn't tell it to anyone. She packed her kit on the evening of the 3rd day at Taji, checked her equipment twice, using a laminated card she'd made herself, and sat down to study the terrain maps for another 2 hours before she slept. Krebs found her at the map table at 0200 and pulled up a chair without asking. They spent an hour on the elevation profiles and the likely wind patterns and said very little else. They had developed, in the 10 days since she'd arrived, a professional shorthand that communicated more in silence than most partnerships managed in full sentences. The insertion was by ground, a 4-vehicle convoy that dropped them at the base of the ridgeline at 0330. Weston and Krebs moved to the release point and then continued alone. The climb was steep and loose in places, shale and limestone, the kind of terrain that punished anything less than full attention. And they moved slowly, deliberately, using handholds that Weston had identified from the satellite imagery. She was carrying 61 pounds of equipment. She didn't mention this. She moved. The hide site was established by 0615, 40 minutes ahead of schedule. Weston settled into position, adjusted the bipod twice, ranged the road through her scope, and noted the time. Krebs logged their position and sent the encrypted check-in. Then they waited. The first 18 hours were uneventful. A fuel truck moved through the corridor in the early afternoon. 3 civilian vehicles, a motorcycle twice, nothing matching the profile they were looking for. They ate cold rations and rotated sleep in 4-hour blocks and spoke in low voices about very little. Krebs had grown up near Dayton and had opinions about Ohio State football that he shared in careful detail. Weston listened more than she contributed. She had grown up in western Montana, in a small town outside Billings, where her father had run a hunting guide operation for 20 years, and where she had started shooting at age 7 and hadn't stopped. She didn't talk about that much. Some background is context and some is just noise, and she had learned early to tell the difference. It was on the second afternoon, around 15:30, that Krebs noticed something on the northern approach. 2 technical vehicles, he said quietly, 1,200 out, moving slow. Weston was already on them. The vehicles, flatbed trucks with heavy weapons mounted in the bed, were not part of the original profile. They were moving with a deliberateness that suggested route familiarity. They stopped twice on the approach. The second stop was longer, and a figure climbed out of the lead vehicle and studied the ridgeline through what appeared to be binoculars. "They're running a counter-sniper check," Krebs said. "I know. We're well concealed. I know." She didn't move. She controlled her breathing in the way she'd learned, not in any training environment, but from her father, at age 14, lying prone in a November field in Montana, waiting for a shot that had taken 30 minutes to materialize. "You don't fight stillness," he'd told her once. "You become it." She'd never been able to explain that to anyone who hadn't grown up the way she had, so she'd stopped trying. The figure with the binoculars studied the ridgeline for 4 minutes. Then he returned to the vehicle. The convoy continued. They logged the vehicles, their movement pattern, the counter-surveillance behavior, the time. Krebs transmitted everything on the next scheduled window. The response from the task force came back within 20 minutes. Hold position, continue observation, confirm resupply confirmation before engagement. "They want us to wait for the actual shipment," Krebs said. "That's what I thought. Could be another 12 hours. Could be." She adjusted her position slightly, took a sip from her hydration tube, and returned her eye to the scope. That was the conversation. Krebs went back to his logbook. The mountain held them in its particular silence. Wind, distant birds, the faint mechanical sound of something on the valley floor that never resolved into anything identifiable, and they stayed inside it. The resupply convoy arrived at 0340 the following morning. Krebs picked them up first on the thermal, 4 vehicles, moving without lights in a staggered column. They watched the convoy for 11 minutes before Weston made a determination. The second vehicle in the column was carrying something on a flatbed that matched the dimensional profile of the targeting package they'd been briefed on. Heavy, covered, transported with the kind of careful spacing that suggested the load was either valuable or unstable. "I count 9 dismounts," Krebs said. 10. There's one on the far side of vehicle 4 behind the rear tire." Krebs shifted his optic. "You're right." She had already done the math on the primary target. 1,140 meters, adjusted for the elevation differential and the current wind reading. She'd been tracking the wind for the last 6 hours, noting the changes in the vegetation on the valley floor, the way the thermals shifted after 0200 when the mountain cold began to push down. The density altitude calculation she'd updated at midnight. She held all of it in a kind of organized readiness, available without searching, the way a surgeon holds instrument knowledge during a procedure. "On your call," Krebs said. She waited. The convoy was slowing. The flatbed vehicle was pulling to the side of the road. Confirmed primary, confirmed, Krebs said. She exhaled slowly. At the bottom of the exhale, in the natural respiratory pause before the body begins to inhale again, she pressed the trigger. The Barrett spoke once. The round traveled the 1,140 meters in just over a second. In that second, Weston was already adjusting for the second target position, reading Krebs's corrections before he'd finished giving them, moving with the methodical economy of someone who had done this enough times that the mechanics had gone somewhere below conscious thought and left only clarity. She fired 4 more times in the next 40 seconds. The convoy did not continue. They held position for another 90 minutes, standard protocol, watching for the response that didn't come. Then they began the extraction, moving back down the ridgeline in the same careful silence they'd used on the ascent. Weston carried the same 61 pounds back down. Her knees would bother her for 2 days afterward, which she didn't mention. The debrief happened at 1100 in a room at the task force compound. Okafor was there. Buell was there. Several people from the intelligence section, someone from a 3-letter agency whose name Weston was never given and whose role was never clearly explained, who sat in the back corner and asked 2 precise questions and then said nothing else for the remainder of the session. The intelligence analysis that came back 48 hours later confirmed the cargo match. The after-action report would describe the engagement as a textbook precision interdiction. Okafor signed it. He used the word executed because he appreciated the precision of that word. Buell didn't say anything in the debrief. He made notes on his pad and looked at the photographs from Krebs's spotting scope and didn't volunteer an opinion. After the debrief, in the hallway, he stopped Weston. She waited. "Good shooting," he said. Just that. She nodded once and walked to the chow hall. She was hungry and her knees hurt, and she was already thinking about the next mission package that Okafor had mentioned was coming out of planning. She ate by herself, which was her preference, and drank 2 cups of coffee and read a paperback novel she'd been working on for 2 weeks. The novel was a Western, which some people would have found ironic and others would have found entirely logical. Okafor found her there an hour later. "Task Force wants to know if you're available for the Mosul package," he said. "When does it spin up?" 72 hours. She turned a page. "I'm available." He sat down across from her with his own coffee and didn't say anything for a moment. There was something he wanted to say, she could tell. Okafor was not an effusive man, but he had a particular quality of pausing before things that mattered to him, and she let him find it without prompting. "When Buell made that comment," he said finally, "about your hands, I remember, I should have said something at the time." She considered this. Outside, the compound was in its midday rhythm, generators, distant vehicle movement, the particular acoustic texture of a forward operating base at rest. She had grown used to this sound. It had become a kind of background condition of her adult life, more familiar in some ways than the quiet of Montana. "It wouldn't have changed anything," she said. "No," Okafor agreed, "but it would have been the right thing to do." She looked up from her book. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had spent 20 years trying to do the right thing in conditions that rarely made it straightforward, and who had accumulated enough failures in that effort to be honest about them. "You did the right thing where it mattered," she said. He nodded slowly, drank his coffee. "The Mosul package," he said. "It's going to be complex. Urban multiple positions, tight windows. It's going to be the hardest thing we've done out here." "Good," Weston said, and turned another page. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the controlled version of one, the kind a man permits himself when he's seen enough of the world to know that certain things deserve acknowledgement without ceremony. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and pushed back his chair. At the door of the chow hall, he stopped. "Weston," she looked up. "You qualified on the 82 at Fort Moore. What was your score?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded just once and walked out into the midday heat. She went back to her book. The record at Fort Moore still stood, though she'd never mentioned it to anyone at Taji. She didn't see the point. Records were just measurements. They told you where you'd been, not where you were going. The Mosul package was 72 hours out, and she hadn't studied the urban terrain profiles yet. And there was still a chapter left in her novel. And she had always been someone who liked to finish what she started. Outside, the compound noise continued without her. She read, and the afternoon settled around her like something that had been there all along, waiting for the noise to stop so it could be heard.